Hi, everyone. It's Kristen Hawkins, and welcome to this new episode of the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast. As you all know, we are in season 2, and the theme of season 2 is Pro-Life 101. So we've talked already about how abortions are committed. We've talked about how the fetal human develops, how abortion harms women. Today, we're going to talk about why abortion is always wrong, even in the hard cases. And so I've brought on the expert of experts, the best pro-life apologist in the entire universe, Stephanie Gray. Stephanie is amazing. If you all were at the National Pro-Life Summit, you've heard her. You've probably seen her videos. We push out our videos as much as possible. Stephanie runs an organization called Love Unleashes Life. She's based up in Canada. She's given over 1,000 or close to 1,000 presentations about abortion to students. She's debated several abortionists in Canada, Malcolm Potts, UC, I think it's UC Berkeley, NARAL directors. So she is, if you want to know how to be a pro-life apologist, how to debate about abortion, you have to follow Stephanie online, watch her videos. I certainly do. And I know I'll never be as good as she is. So that's why she's my guest today, because she can answer these questions and you don't have to hear them from me. Hey. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, Kristen. You are very kind. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. I can't believe I didn't have you the whole season 1.
Yeah, well, someone prepared the way. It was the John the Baptist. Not that I have a Messiah complex, but...
No, I was trying to get most of our interviews in person, and then with COVID, let's just go to Skype. And so it's actually broadened my horizons of like, oh, all these people that I normally don't see, I can have a conversation with them now.
Technology connects us, indeed.
There you go. Okay, so I have a series of questions, things that I hear all the time on campuses, things I'm sure folks who are listening or watching here. So my thought was to just go through some of these questions with you,
Great.
Have you respond, and maybe give us some of your best tips for responding, because we also know it's not always about what you say, it's about how you say it. So
absolutely.
I have been told that my problem is people can see what I'm thinking when I'm talking. So even if I am saying the nice thing, I may be thinking you're an idiot. And apparently that's displayed on my face.
Oh,
so
dear.
I'm trying to work on that. Okay. So the first one, that we always get, no matter where we're at, if we're online doing an Instagram takeover or on campus, what do you say to those people who say, I know abortion's wrong, I'm pro-life, but what about cases of rape?
Yes, definitely. I would say the most commonly raised objection to the pro-life perspective. And there are a couple different directions we could go in. I think the first most important direction to go in is to start with expressing sympathy and agreement that rape is a horrible evil, that it is a crime, that the woman has been violated, and that we agree with the abortion supporter that she deserves our compassion, she deserves our support, and deserves healing and support in that journey to healing. Once we've taken that step, the next thing I recommend is to start with a question and to say, a question I have to ask myself. But when you make that point, you're also asking the other person the same thing. And so I'll say the question I have to ask myself is this: is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? Now, the language there that I've chosen is very intentional. I could have said, is it fair to kill the child? But the reason why I chose death penalty over kill is because in my experience, most abortion supporters are opposed to the death penalty. And so what we're trying to do is tap into their objection to killing the guilty and tie that into what's happening in the case of abortion if a child is conceived as a result of rape, and then refer to the child not merely as a child, but as an innocent child. Because even if we debate when it comes to the death penalty, how should we treat the guilty? Should the guilty get the death penalty? Should they not? There is a rigorous debate on that issue. Some people support killing the guilty, some people oppose killing the guilty, but both sides of that debate agree that the death penalty should never be given to the innocent. So there is consensus that we should never directly and intentionally kill an innocent human being. So we want to then ask that person to consider, is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? Now, in my experience, what the abortion supporter might come back with is to say, well, it's not a child yet, which then brings us to the question of when life begins. I'll often tell a basic analogy or a story and say, imagine you have a rape victim who is pregnant, but she had sex consensually with her partner the day before she was raped, so that when she finds out she's pregnant, she actually can't determine, looking at the pregnancy test, whether her conceived child's father is her partner who she loves or the rapist who she despises. So let's imagine she carries through with that pregnancy with the hopes that she's carrying her partner's child. And after the baby is born, they run a paternity test and find out the child is actually the rapist baby, not her partner's. I would then ask the question, after that very simple analogy or story, would we allow that woman to end the born child's life because of the father's crime? And then the abortion supporter will say, of course not. You can't kill a born child because of the father's crime. So then we ask, why then may we kill the preborn child because of the father's crime? And if they say it's not a child, then that really gets us away from the question of rape and more onto the question of when does life begin, which earlier in your series, I'm sure you guys tackled the science of life beginning at fertilization.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think when you kind of get started in your pro-life journey and kind of identify yourself as a pro-lifer, you're going to have a bunch of conversations. And I think there's just fear of, I don't really know all the answers. I'm not qualified. I think that's what stops, I know that's what stops a lot of people from speaking out, of being an active member of the pro-life gen. And I want to just tell everybody, it's really not that hard. Like, it's only like 4 questions you ever get asked. And it always comes down to the basic question of what is it? Because even when you start with such a horrible subject like sexual assault, it always comes down to, well, what is it? Because that's always the determining factor of, can I kill it?
Right. Because is our right to life grounded in what we are or how we were conceived? And if our right to life is grounded in how we were conceived, then we're not all equal, because we weren't all conceived the same way. Some people were conceived in love. Some people were conceived in lust. Some people were conceived in violence in the case of sexual assault. But if our right to life is grounded in who we are as members of the human family, then all of us equally have the same human nature that began at fertilization, regardless of the circumstances of that fertilization.
Yeah. And I always try to say, look, I realize like this is a hard subject to talk about. And, it's something that I've had to wrestle with when I became pro-life, of how do I feel about this? But I realize if I'm saying this, if I truly believe that preborn child has the same rights as you and I, that has that same worth, that really you cannot make that case. There's no logical case to be made as I'm a pro-lifer and I believe this, but not really for this group of people, because really that's not a pro-life position.
Absolutely. Consistency is hugely important. And the moment we're inconsistent, then the other side will rightly question our fundamental premise about everyone being equal and everyone having the right to life.
Yeah. That's the consistency question often gets me in trouble on campuses, because then they ask other things and I have to tell them the truthful answer, and then they didn't want to hear that answer.
Right.
I think I got in trouble with MSNBC one time about that too. I still get tagged from folks on that. All right. So the next question we get, so they'll usually move on from rape. If you've answered the question, then they're going to ask you, well, what about when the mother's life's in danger? Are you going to force women to carry a fetus to term, even though the fetus is killing her?
So again, like with the previous question, it's important to begin where we can identify agreement. So to say to the individual, I agree with you, that's a dilemma. I agree with you, it's a crisis that warrants a response. I may disagree with you about what the ethical response is, but I do agree with you that we ought to respond. And then the next thing I'll do is I'll introduce a little thought experiment in order to demonstrate that just because I say abortion is not an ethical solution, that abortion may not be pursued, it doesn't follow that there's nothing to be done. And so what I'll say is I'll say to the individual, imagine there's a particular driving route that you take home from work every day. And let's imagine one day you're driving home and you get halfway through your trip and you can no longer drive the path you normally take because there's a big sign up that says road closed. And when you look just beyond that sign, you see the road is literally ripped up. So even if you wanted to like break the law and violate the sign, you couldn't drive because there's no roadway anymore. Does that mean you're not going to get home that evening? Of course, it doesn't mean you're not going to get home. What it means is you're going to then follow the other signs that say detour ahead. And you're going to follow all the arrows that take you down new and different roads that nonetheless lead to your destination of home. So I use that as an analogy to say when the woman's life is in danger, as a pro-lifer, we have to say no to abortion, no to directly and intentionally killing an innocent human being. Essentially, that's like road closed. You may not go down that path. But that doesn't mean you can't save her life. What we do is we take a detour. We go another path, and what that other path involves is intervening in a way that respects the lives of both the mother and the child, not directly and intentionally killing either, doing our best to save both lives. And in some cases, depending on how far in the pregnancy the child is, with technology, incubators, and so forth, we can intervene in whatever her medical condition is, that of the mother, in a way where the child's life can also be preserved. You may have a situation early in pregnancy, such as a tubal pregnancy, where the child is stuck in the fallopian tube, and we don't have the technology to keep the child alive. But you can still intervene in that without directly and intentionally targeting the baby's body for destruction. There's a procedure that's not an abortion called a salpingectomy, and that procedure is done, which removes the tube, which is the situation of crisis because it's a part of the mother's body expanding. If bursts will kill the child and can kill the mom. So abortion isn't ethical, but the detour ahead would be a salpingectomy, which still leads us to saving the mother's life, and hopefully one day will come where we have the technology to keep the baby alive. But not being able to save someone because we lack technology is not the same thing as using technology we do have to directly and intentionally kill someone, which is what abortion does.
Yeah, it's about the intent. And I know we had one of our earlier episodes, we had a good friend, Dr. John Bashowski. He committed abortions earlier in his career. And we often talk about that of, does the doctor see that he has two patients, or does he see that he has one patient?
Right.
And what's the intent there? Of sometimes you aren't able to save both, but what is your intent? Is your intent to go in? And he described it as, is your intent to go in to destroy, or is your intent to go in to save? And then often, like, he gets all the cases where the women have been told, just have an abortion, and he'll say, no, let's try this. We'll put you on bed rest. And I actually have one of our support students' wife, his wife was on bed rest starting at 14 weeks.
Wow.
On bed rest, and she ended up not miscarrying. She ended up delivering in her, like, she was in the 30th week, so she was almost full term. But had she gone to any other doctor, they would have said, yep, the miscarriage has started. There's nothing we can do. Let us go in and commit that D&C and get it taken care of. And so, there are physicians who are out there who are willing to help in that moment of crisis when her life's at risk, and they'll give her an honest assessment of, can you remain pregnant, and if remain pregnant, is that going to be substantially harmful to your life? So
and that's all the more why we need pro-life physicians and any pro-life medical students or pre-med students listening. Like, we need you in the medical field so that we have this alternative, life-affirming perspective, which says, when a woman's pregnant, there's two patients. How do I do my best to preserve both lives?
That's right. Absolutely. What do you say? Now, I get this one at every place I go. And this has been a new one because I remember when I started speaking campuses, it didn't come up as much, but now it comes up every time. So it's the suffering question. What would you say to someone who says, well, those children, they're going to be born with a disability or life-threatening illness. They're going to be born with SFLA. They're going to die moments after birth. Why would you force a mother to go through that and, force that child to live in pain? Or, why would you force a child, is going to be born into poverty, is going to be have to live in foster care and be abused? How dare you force somebody to do that and to inflict pain on another person.
Yeah. So whenever people bring up pain and suffering, again, we start with agreeing that's a problem that warrants a response, that we should aim to alleviate someone's suffering. Our goal, however, should be to alleviate suffering without eliminating the sufferer. If we think, for example, about why we're horrified by any child who's born who is abused, who could be in a bad foster care situation, we're horrified because an individual is being treated unjustly because they're being harmed. But if it's harmful to abuse a child, how much more is it harmful to kill a child? So homicide should not be a solution to abuse. I would suggest homicide is yet another form of abuse. I think we need to talk about how we can alleviate suffering without eliminating sufferers. So if someone's actually in physical pain, first of all, medical technology has advanced today, pharmaceuticals have advanced to a level that we can intervene and really alleviate people's pain in the vast majority of situations. When people talk about children with a poor prenatal diagnosis, living a life of pain, in more cases than not, we're not talking about physical pain, but there might be emotional suffering. There might be different degrees of challenges that come along with living a life of physical and genetic difference. But we can still alleviate that without eliminating them. And one of the things I like to do is I like to point to the insights of Holocaust survivor and author who was also a psychiatrist, Dr. Viktor Frankl. He wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And one of his observations as someone who had suffered profoundly in the concentration camps, who had patients after the war when he was a psychiatrist who had come to him with all kinds of suffering, one of his observations from observation and lived experience was this. He said, despair is suffering without meaning. And Dr. Frankl's whole point was that suffering is part of the human experience. All of us have suffered and all of us will suffer. So rather than eliminating the individual who's experiencing suffering, we need to avoid despair by injecting or introduce meaning to their situation, not simply in response to the suffering, but perhaps because of it. And he gives this great example of a teenager from Texas who had been in a car accident. She became quadriplegic, so therefore paralyzed from the neck down. And Dr. Frankl said, let me tell you how this young woman who's suffering lives her days. He said she watches the news, reads the news, listens to the news. And he said whenever she comes across a story of someone who's going through hardship, maybe a natural disaster, whatever the case may be, some terrible news story, he said she calls for an assistant to come to her and place a stick in her mouth. He said she then uses the stick to pound out letters on a keyboard in order to write notes of encouragement to people that she read about in the news. And Dr. Frankl said that young woman lives a life of profound joy, fulfillment, and meaning. Is her life free of suffering? No, she has a lot of suffering in her life, but her life is free of despair because she has found meaning in her suffering. Her ability to empathize with others, to encourage others, to give words of hope to others is directly connected to her own experience of suffering. It reminds me of a time I met a university student who was initially in our conversation suggesting that children in foster care would be better off had they been aborted. But then he began to share his own experience of growing up in a very abusive home, bounced in and out of different foster care families, back to his own biological parents who abused him, back to foster care and so forth. And as we talked further, he shared with me that he was in college to become a social worker because he wanted to help other children in the foster care system to avoid the types of suffering that he himself had lived through. So I was then able to share with him, you are proof that rather than killing being our solution, finding meaning in our suffering needs to be the solution, so that not only do we not despair, but we prevent others from either having the suffering we faced or despairing in light of the suffering that they may currently be facing. And so that, I think, is the key. Whatever someone's suffering, we need to help find meaning. And when we do that, we alleviate suffering without eliminating the sufferer. And that needs to be the key point.
That was beautiful. You did. That was great. That was. I love that, about helping them find meaning.
Yes.
I think that's so key, because you hear these arguments all the time, and it's almost as if suffering itself has become like this intrinsic moral wrong, this intrinsic moral evil. And I was like, well, no, it's not. It's not a moral right or a wrong. It's how you behave, how you endure the suffering, because all of us will suffer. It's a part of being a human being.
Right.
But it's a fascinating. It's fascinating how so many get so confused. Like that young man who is going to be a social worker, wanting to help children like himself, who obviously was compassionate and loving, but then had this total and utter disconnect for the preborn child.
Now, the good news was, as we were conversing, I think the connections were starting to be made, and he was able to see, oh, I see where you're going with this. And then actually we built such a rapport with each other that I said, look, I don't want to weird you out, but if you're willing to give me your address, I will hop on Amazon and I will ship you a copy of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And he's like, yeah, no, actually, I would love that book. So then sure enough, he gave me his address. I hopped on Amazon and sent him the book. And so I highly recommend anyone who's listening, if they have yet to read Man's Search for Meaning, it's a profoundly insightful book where so many lessons can be drawn on the topic of abortion and the pro-life cause at the beginning of life, but even the end of life. Now we're facing assisted suicide and euthanasia in so many parts of the world. In more and more states are wanting to introduce this. So having a real understanding of how we ought to respond to suffering is something, in a life-affirming way, is something Viktor Frankl does masterfully.
Well, I mean, you bring up a good point about the end of life. This is something where I feel like not all pro-lifers have the same view on assisted suicide, euthanasia. I think it becomes that suffering question, right? Of, well, the preborn is innocent. The preborn doesn't have a say in what happens to him or her. Where it's different, and I've actually heard this from a pro-lifer. It's different because assisted suicide, they're choosing it. So they're fully aware of what they're choosing. And so it's not like obviously euthanasia is bad because that's someone else choosing that you should die. But with assisted suicide, they're able to choose their death. And so it was an interesting conversation I had with this pro-lifer because she is non-religious. So she didn't, there wasn't any, moral qualms about committing suicide in her mind. But yeah, we went round and round on that for a while. But how do you answer that question? How have you started talking about? I don't talk a lot about assisted suicide and life enough on this podcast. So thank you for bringing it up. Now you can answer.
Yeah. Well, what comes to mind is a question that my friends Jonathan Van Maren and Blaise Lane raise in their book on assisted suicide. And the question is this: who gets suicide assistance and who gets suicide prevention? And they take that question and have you imagine, maybe you're walking on a bridge and you see someone is about to jump off, obviously to their death. And they suggest, as you approach that individual, how do you decide before that person is actually jumped, when you get close enough, whether you push them off or whether you pull them back? Now, they raise that kind of shocking thought experiment because they know everyone will instinctively say, oh my gosh, I would never push the person off. Like, I would do everything I can to pull them back. So then what you do to the person who responds that way is say, okay, imagine you're not on a bridge and imagine that person isn't going to jump off. Imagine you work in a hospital and you have an elderly patient whose cancer treatments are no longer working. They've been told they have 6 months left to live. And they say to you, I want to die. I want, essentially, to figuratively speaking, jump off the bridge. Will you provide the injection? I'm giving you permission, but will you give me the injection or will you give me the drug to swallow? And if you were to ask that person, would you do it? Most people who support assisted suicide would say, yes, I'd give them the drug, I'd do the injection. So then you say, well, why would you help that person? And they will likely say what you were alluding to with your question, which is choice, independence, freedom. Like, they're claiming they want it. And so out of respect for their choice, I ought to let them in freedom make that decision. And if I can in some way be a help by giving them the resources they need, I should do it. And then I would say, okay, but if it's all about respecting the other person's choice, then why would you pull the person off the bridge? Because like the individual in the hospital, they too want to make the choice. They're choosing a different method. but they still want to end their life. If you override their choice and you override their desire and you pull them back from the bridge, you've actually revealed that the issue isn't choice. What you've realized, or what you may not have realized until now, is that you are being directed not by choice, but by judgment. When you're on the bridge, you're making a judgment that the individual who's going to jump off is a life worth saving. Mm-hmm. But when you're in the hospital, if you're going to provide that injection, then believe it or not, you're making a judgment that individual's life is not worth saving. Mm-hmm. So we being society, claims it's about choice when it's actually about judgment. So the question then becomes, if we believe we're all equal, who are we to judge this life is worth saving, but this life isn't worth saving? So if we believe we're all equal, instead of some getting suicide assistance and some getting suicide prevention, everyone should get the same thing equally. So we either give suicide assistance to everyone, which instinctively makes most people uncomfortable, mm-hmm. or we give suicide prevention to everyone, which of course the one response that people are most comfortable with would be giving suicide prevention to everyone. Because, if I were to say the names, Robin Williams, Kate Spade, Anthony Bourdain, we hear those names and everyone thinks suicide. And if you were to ask people, when you think of those names and you think of their suicides, do you think that was a great thing they did, or do you think it was a tragic thing they did? And of course, the average person is going to say, oh, it was tragic. It was so tragic. Those individuals ended their lives. So then if they should have gotten suicide prevention, if we believe we're all equal, everyone should get suicide prevention. And the next point I would make is, if suicide is tragic, how does throwing the word assisted in front of suicide suddenly make a tragic thing positive or good or worthy of our involvement? Instead, we should be just as saddened by assisted suicide as we are generally universally saddened by suicide itself.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's awesome.
Great.
I started writing some notes and I just gave up because I'm like, I'm going to have to listen to my podcast myself.
Awesome. Well, I have a whole book coming out on that very topic by the end of the year.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. We need it. We need it desperately. Yes. I mean, I think because when you start this conversation and you get them to that point of suicide prevention, or really just helping everybody, letting them to commit suicide, then I think the question then comes back to the suffering, right? Because they'll say, but they're suffering, Kristen. They're suffering, right. And that gets you back to the earlier point of what is
everyone suffers. So then the moment suffering becomes the reason to justify suicide or suicide assistance, then everyone has access to that.
Yeah, everyone has justification
because we all suffer. So then it becomes, well, what degree of suffering? And then how do we arbitrarily decide, well, your suffering isn't suffering enough, but this person's is. Instead, we need to inject meaning, and you will actually find the experience of suffering, while not being eliminated, can be alleviated.
That's right. Absolutely right. I guess, I don't know, what's your best approach for dealing with the mushy middle? I don't like abortion. I agree with you. I would never have an abortion myself, but I can't tell a woman, or I really can't judge the situation a woman is in. Do you have what I'm asking for is something you probably don't have, but what is the silver bullet here, Stephanie? What is the be all and all? Shut them all up and say, there you go, I've changed your mind, because
right.
I haven't found it yet.
Right. Okay. Well, what I actually would say is to get them to shut up is to get them to speak up.
That's right.
And we have to shut up. So it's more like when we encounter the individual that says, yeah, I wouldn't have an abortion, but, in this case or that case, how could I? Exactly. Is we ask the question, why wouldn't you personally have an abortion? Or why are you uncomfortable with abortion? And encourage them to vocalize their thoughts and feelings, what makes them uncomfortable. And I had a friend years ago in university who made a similar comment to me, and I asked her that question, and her response was, oh, I just couldn't imagine a life being sucked out of me. So then I was able to take what she had contributed to the conversation, what had come out of her, and said, so it sounds to me, what she admitted, exactly, it sounds to me that you're acknowledging within the womb of a pregnant woman is a life, that abortion sucks that life out. So if it makes you uncomfortable at the thought of you sucking a life out, how would it ever be okay for someone else to suck a life out? We could make an analogy also at that point and say, imagine someone says they're personally opposed to slavery, but they're uncomfortable supporting a law that would ban slavery. And imagine you said, well, why are you opposed to slavery personally? And imagine the person says, well, because I just don't think it's right to violate the basic rights of another human being, to mistreat them, to do things to them we wouldn't want done to ourselves. So we take what they said, we serve it back and say, how would it ever be acceptable for someone else to violate the rights of another human, to do something to them that they wouldn't want done to themselves? So we want to help through questions and basic analogies, help the person come to their own conclusion that they're holding a contradictory view, and that their own personal revulsion towards abortion is an indicator that other people should be opposed and repulsed by that thing for the very same reasons, and therefore no one should be allowed access to it.
All right, so you brought up slavery. So I did this recently on campus, and I think our regional coordinator wanted to smack me because it was a similar discussion. A woman. And it was, I'm pro-life. I hear you. I'm against abortion, but, and I went into slavery. I was feeling sassy. And so I said, oh, well, okay. So let me just say a statement to you and you tell me if it sounds wrong. And then of course there was a Black student union. Their club was tabling next to ours. So then I ended up having 10 Black students start yelling, screaming at me because they said, you said slavery is okay. And I was like, no, and so, but it was the very fact that I was pro-life, I'm white, and I dared mention slavery.
Right.
And so this is kind of a debate in the pro-life movement of how do you bring up other atrocities that have been human rights atrocities that have been committed? Because I am of the belief that I think it provides, I'm a history person. I think it provides context, right? Of like, this has happened before. This actually, sadly, isn't unique. It continues to happen, this dehumanization of a human being. And it just depends on where their location and how, where they're at, and what kind of dehumanization happens. But it's kind of a debate. Like our team is even debated of like, don't ever bring up the Holocaust. Don't ever bring it up, or don't ever bring up slavery. I'm more controversial. I like to bring it up. But how do you think it is a good way to produce the most dialogue, the most minds changed? Is it just something you just never bring up, or are there ways you have found that it has been effective to bring up the Holocaust or slavery or child labor?
Right. I absolutely think we should view these analogies as tools in a toolbox, and that there are times to use those tools. But there does need to be discernment. Is this going to make the point I need to make with my audience, or is it going to cause them to be so shocked that their eyes close, their ears are covered, and they can't even receive my message? Sometimes we don't know until we try. So I think when making very shocking analogies, what is helpful is to ensure you do it in a context where you have time to break it down, where you have time to explain it. When something is really shocking, when something's very confusing, there's an advantage that comes along with that. The individual's inability to comprehend it makes them think more about it. I remember once years ago seeing a big billboard ad, and I was confused every time I saw it. The message on the billboard was not clear. And then I became conscious of the fact every time I drove past, I was thinking more and more about it because I was like, I want to figure this out. So making shocking analogies that cause people to say, what? That makes no sense, isn't necessarily bad, and in fact can be quite helpful precisely because the person then thinks, wait, how is that connection happening? And then where you have the venue to actually break it down, to talk, for example, about the nature of an analogy. when we analogize to things such as abortion and let's say slavery, we're not saying they're identical. What we're saying is there's some element of both of these that is comparable. And that comparable thing is the dehumanization of individuals in order to rationalize mistreatment of those individuals. And just as the one group, preborn children, are denied their basic humanity, this other group, historically Black people, were denied their humanity. And so, but we're not saying it's the exact same thing. It's often like, let's imagine, you have a baby, and imagine I have a puppy, and I come and I see your new baby, and I say, oh my goodness, your baby is as cute as my puppy. I am not telling you that your child is a dog. What I'm doing is I'm taking what in my life I define as cute, cuddly, life-giving, and joy-giving, and I'm now associating cute, cuddly, life-giving, and joy-giving to your child. Therefore, not saying your child is a dog, but rather your child has those qualities that I associate with in my single state with my pet, with my dog. And so you could use that to explain the nature of an analogy and then bridge to the more controversial analogy you were making. And people having a harsh reaction is an opportunity for deeper thought, which is what we need. People aren't thinking deeply. So we want to almost in a way provoke, but provoke in a way where we have the space to then work with what that provocation did and lead them to thinking deeper and therefore changing their minds.
I love it. I mean, I was having this discussion with somebody the other day, and I said, change only happens at the point of conflict. Like, Americans don't want to talk about abortion. We don't want to talk. No one wants to talk about uncomfortable subjects. Right. But if no one talks about those things, there's never going to be a resolution. And it's what Martin Luther King talked about, the negative piece versus the positive piece, right? There might be a piece, but it's a negative piece because we're just not simply speaking out and up about the injustice that's currently happening. Positive piece means it's going to be uncomfortable for a while. We're going to have to talk about these things. So yeah,
absolutely. It's at that moment of, if we think even, when someone, other than maybe going for an annual checkup where you don't have any symptoms of anything wrong, but you think, well, I should have my, health checked. I should, have my blood checked just in case there's something wrong with me. It is, other than a situation like that where we might be proactive, most situations, health crises are discovered because there is a painful indicator. You have pain in your abdomen. You go to your doctor and the doctor does a scan and finds out you have a cancerous tumor growing, and you only responded now to the cancerous tumor because you felt pain. Pain, the experience of pain, is what caused you to respond. And in fact, the real problem with any type of illness, cancer or something else, is when you don't have indicators, when you don't have warning signs, when you aren't experiencing pain, because then we don't respond. So in the same way, when someone is poked, when they're provoked, when they're like, oh my goodness, this is shocking, that's then an opportunity to go deeper and figure out what is behind the reaction we're experiencing or the disconnect in our mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, all right. Is there anything I didn't ask you in all your wisdom that I should, now that I have you on the podcast finally, that I should have asked you that our folks need to hear and need to be kind of using in their toolkit when they're having conversations?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind as you ask me that. The first is to go slowly with people. To realize that when we start having conversations where the topic is heated, we can get naturally so impassioned because we think lives are literally on the line, and we feel this great burden and responsibility to protect those lives, that we can perhaps come on so strong and be so quick with our quips and our responses that although our goal is to change the person's mind, to keep them engaged in conversation, if we come on too forcefully, the conversation could end. So to remember that the burden you feel should lead you to a goal where you change a mind and you save a life. And if that's the goal, then we want to take the path that is most likely to get us to achieve that goal. And what I have found is the the slower I go in the conversation, the less intense I am. Even though I am an intense person, my mind moves a mile a minute. I have really fast responses, and it's exhausting for me to debate people because I often have to put so much energy into restraining myself and not responding at the pace that comes naturally, because I am more likely to achieve my goal. So to say to, pro-lifers listening is, when the person says something, pause before you would naturally respond. Be slower than you normally would. Really try to think through what they've said. Say that's a good point. Saying that's a good point does not mean what they've communicated is truth. It does not mean you're violating your pro-life position. But it is acknowledging, if someone says, well, what about pregnancy in the case of rape? That's a good point. That's worth considering. It doesn't mean abortion is okay in response to pregnancy from rape, but it's something worth exploring. And then pause some more and then say, well, what about this in the question I suggested at the beginning? And if you go slower, the person is more likely to stay. If you are calm, they're more likely to be calm. And the longer the conversation lasts, the more likely you're to make inroads, which will then lead you to your goal of changing the mind and saving a life, even if you're unaware of it in that moment. I've learned years after certain encounters or with pro-life outreaches that I've done, I've learned years after the fact about people who changed their mind. In the moment, they never acknowledged that to myself or colleagues, but it was as time passed that they came back and said, I used to be pro-choice and now I'm pro-life. So to go slowly. And then the other thing, I've talked about asking questions to provoke the other person to think, to verbalize, to express. I've talked about analogies, which are really just made up stories. But the more we can also use real stories, I think the more fruitful our exchanges will be. So I think, for example, when asked about pregnancy from rape, what comes to mind is the question, will abortion unrape a rape victim? And then the story I use to answer that, which is of a friend of mine who's a public speaker, you might have heard of her, Liana Rebelito. Liana Rebelito grew up in Mexico City, and when she was 12 years old, she was kidnapped and held for a few days, brutally and repeatedly raped. When she was freed, a short while later, went to the doctor and found out she was pregnant. Okay, she's 12 years old, and she's now told that she's pregnant. And the doctors offered her an abortion. And remarkably, at that tender age, Liana asked the doctor a question. She said, if I have an abortion, will it take away all the terrible feelings I'm experiencing, that I'm dirty, that no matter how many times I shower, I can't feel clean? Will it take away all my nightmares, all my traumas and memories? And so the doctor had to answer, technically, an abortion won't do that. And in one of her interviews, Liana said, then I just didn't see the point. She said, all I knew was there was a life inside of me. The life needed me and I needed her. So remarkably, Liana carried through with the pregnancy, not only gave birth to her daughter, but parented her daughter, who became her best friend. And one of the things Liana shared with me when I first met her was that due to the trauma of the sexual assault, she became suicidal. And she was tempted to kill herself, but the reason she didn't kill herself was because she was pregnant. And she had this sense, even though she herself felt worthless, wrongly felt that way, of course. She was, valuable, and the rape didn't change her value, but she felt that way. But as much as she felt that way about herself, she didn't want to end the child's life, and she knew if she killed herself, it would kill the child. So she said to me, Stephanie, I saved my daughter's life, but she saved mine. Her daughter became her will to live. And so it's one thing to just talk in theory about why abortion is wrong in cases of rape, about how abortion doesn't unrape a rape victim. But when we can introduce a real story of someone who has lived through that experience and come through it with a wholehearted pro-life perspective, that makes our position all the more powerful. So I think we want to go slowly with people. We want to ask questions, but we want to draw on the lived experience of people who have done the right thing even when it's hard and stand by it. And their example will then inspire others.
That's excellent advice. That's an amazing story as well. What's her name again? I'm going to Google her.
Yeah, Liana Rebelito. Her story is truly remarkable. I met her in Guatemala. We both were speaking there, and it was interesting because she speaks English and Spanish, but obviously in Guatemala she gave her talk in Spanish. So I'm sitting there the whole time, not understanding a word she's saying, and I had a translator for when I spoke. And then it was only after our first event, when we were taken back to the hotel, that we had dinner together and we started sharing our stories. And then she told me what her whole pro-life message is. So Liana Rebelito, I highly recommend looking her up.
That's amazing. And you all, the tips that Stephanie gave you are legit. She will deliver some very truthful but hard to hear information, and yet the crowd still loves her. Because it's the way you deliver the information. You're a master at the presentation that you make. So not only do you have the science and the logic on your side, but your delivery is always spot on. So thank you so much for giving us your time today and coming and sharing some of these tips. I know there's going to be a lot of comments. How do folks follow you, Stephanie, and kind of keep in touch and hopefully maybe come hear you when next time you're near them?
Yes, absolutely. So people can go to my website, which is loveunleasheslife.com, loveunleasheslife.com. It's my ministry name, my book name. And if people go there, they can sign up for my email list and see my upcoming schedule.
That's right. All right. Well, thanks, Stephanie, for joining us. And thank you all for tuning in this week to Explicitly Pro-Life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and to tell all of your pro-life friends to subscribe to Explicitly Pro-Life. And you definitely want to make sure you forward on this episode. Bye, guys.